No sooner had the Prophet, PBUH, discharged the affair of Khaybar than he started a fresh move towards Wadi al-Qura, another Jewish colony in Arabia. He mobilized his forces and divided them into 3 regiments with 4 banners entrusted to Sid bin Ubadah, al-Ubab bin Mundir, Abad bin Bishr and Saul bin Hanif. Prior to fighting, he invited the Jews to embrace Islam, but all his words and exhortations fell on deaf ears. 11 of the Jews were killed one after another, and with each one newly killed, a fresh call was extended inviting those people to profess the new faith. Fighting went on ceaselessly for approximately 2 days and resulted in the full surrender of the Jews. Their land was conquered, and a lot of booties fell in the hands of the Muslims. The Prophet, PBUH, stayed in Wadi al-Qura for 4 days, distributed the booty among the Muslim fighters and reached an agreement with the Jews similar to that of Khaybar. Zad al-Ma'ad 2:146, 147. The Jews of Taima, hearing beforehand about the successive victories of the Muslim army and the defeats that their brethren, the Jews, had sustained, showed no resistance when the Prophet, PBUH, reached their habitation. On the contrary, they took the initiative and offered to sign a reconciliation treaty to the effect that they receive protection but pay tribute in return. Having achieved his objective and subdued the Jews completely, the Prophet, PBUH, made his way back home and arrived in Medina in late Safar or early Rabi al-Awwal 7H. It is noteworthy that the Prophet, PBUH, being the best amongst war experts, realized quite readily that evacuating Medina after the lapse of the prohibited months, Muharram, Dhul-Qa'dah and Dhul-Hajj, would not be wise at all with the presence of the desert Bedouins roaming in its vicinity. Such a careless attitude, the Prophet, PBUH, believed, would tempt the undisciplined mob to practice their favorite hobby of plundering, looting and all acts of piracy. This premonition always in mind, the Prophet, PBUH, dispatched Aban bin Sa'id at the head of a platoon to deter those Bedouins and forestall any attempt at raiding the headquarters of the nascent Islamic State during his absence in Khaybar. Aban achieved his task successfully and joined the Prophet, PBUH, in Khaybar after it had been conquered. Sporadic invasions. The expedition called Ur-Rika, in the year 7H, having subdued 2 powerful sides of the Confederates' coalition, the Prophet, PBUH, started preparations to discipline the third party, i.e. the desert Bedouins, who took naught for habitation and continued in their usual practices of looting and plundering. Unlike the Jews of Khaybar and the people of Makkah, they had a liking for living in the wilderness dispersed in scattered spots, hence the difficulty of bringing them under control, and the futility of carrying out deterrent campaigns against them. However, the Prophet, PBUH, was determined to put an end to this unacceptable situation and called the Muslims around him to get ready to launch a decisive campaign against those harassing rebels. Meanwhile, it was reported to him that Bani Maharib and Banu Thalba of the Ghatfan tribe were gathering an army in order to encounter the Muslims. The Prophet, PBUH, proceeded towards Najd at the head of 400 or 700 men after he had mandated Abu Dar, in another version, Uthman bin Affan, to dispose of the affairs of Medina during his absence. The Muslim fighters penetrated deep into their land until they reached a spot called Nakla, where they came across some Bedouins of Ghatfan, but no fighting took place because the latter had agreed to go into reconciliation with the Muslims. The Prophet, PBUH, led his followers that day in a prayer of fear. Al-Bukhari, on the authority of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, narrated that they set out on an expedition with the Messenger of Allah, PBUH. We were 6 in number and had, with us, only 1 camel which we rode turn by turn. Our feet were injured. My feet were so badly injured that my nails came off. We, therefore, bandaged our feet with rags, so this expedition was called Ur-Rika, i.e. the expedition of rags. Sahih al-Bukhari 2592, Sahih Muslim 2118. Jabir narrated, in the course of Ur-Rika expedition, we came to a leafy tree where the Prophet, PBUH, sat shading himself off the burning sun. The others dispersed here and there seeking shelter from the heat. The Prophet, PBUH, had a short nap after he had hung his sword on the tree. A polytheist, meanwhile came, seized the sword and unsheathed it. The Prophet, PBUH, woke up to find his sword drawn in the man's hand. The Bedouin here asked the Prophet, unarmed then, who would hold me back from killing you now? The Prophet, PBUH, then answered, it is Allah. In another version, it was reported that the Prophet, PBUH, took the sword when it had fallen down and the man said, you, the Prophet, are the best one to hold a sword. The Prophet, PBUH, asked the man if he would testify to the oneness of Allah and the messengership of Muhammad. The Arabian answered that he would never engage in a fight against him, nor would he ally with people fighting the Muslims. The Prophet, PBUH, set the man free and let him go to his people to say to them that he had seen the best one among all people. Muqtasar Sirat ar-Rasul p. 264, Fath al-Bari 7-416. A woman from the Arabians was taken prisoner in the context of this battle. Her husband, on hearing the news, swore he would never stop until he had shed the blood of a Muslim. Secretly at night, he approached the camp of the Muslims when he saw 2 sentries stationed there to alert the Muslims against any emergency. He shot the first one, Abad bin Bishr, who was observing prayer, with an arrow, but he did not stop prayer, he simply pulled it out. Then he was shot by 3 other arrows but would not interrupt his prayer. After he had done the closing salutations, he awakened his companion Ammar bin Yasir, who remonstrated that he should have alerted him, to which the latter replied that he was halfway through a chapter and did not like to interrupt it. Zad al-Ma'ad 2-112, Ibn Hisham 2-203-209. The victory at the expedition of Rika had a tremendous impact on all the Arabians. It cast fear into their hearts and rendered them too powerless to antagonize the Muslim society in Medina. They began to acquiesce to the prevailing situation and resigned themselves to new geopolitical conditions working in favor of the new religion. Some of them even embraced Islam and took an active part in the conquest of Makkah and the Battle of Hunayn, and received their due shares of the war booty. From that time onward, the anti-Islam tripartite coalition had been subdued, and peace and security prevailed. The Muslims then started to redress any political imbalance and fill in the small gaps that still triggered unrest here and there in the face of the great drive of Islamization that enveloped the whole area. We could in this context mention some of these incidental skirmishes which pointed markedly to the ever-growing power of the Muslim society. 1. A platoon headed by Ghalib bin Abdullah al-Laythi in Safar or in Rabi al-Awwal 7-8 was dispatched to muffle the provocative behavior of Bani al-Mulch. The Muslims managed to kill a large number of enemy soldiers and captured a great deal of booty. A large army of polytheists rushed in their heel, but floods hindered the pursuit, and the Muslims managed to withdraw in safety. 2. Umar bin al-Khattab, at the head of a 30-soldier group, set out to a spot called Turba in Shaban 7H to discipline the people of Hozan. He no longer arrived at their habitation, they fled for their lives. 3. 30 men with Bashir bin Saad al-Ansari headed for Bani Murrah in Shaban at 7H in the Fadak area. He killed a large number of the enemy and seized a lot of their camels and cattle. On his way back, the enemy gathered up forces and overtook the Muslims at night. They showered Bashir and his men with arrows, and killed all the Muslims except Bashir, who took refuge in Fadak and stayed with the Jews there until his wounds healed. 4. Ghalib bin Abdullah al-Laythi at the head of a platoon of 130 men launched an attack against Bani Awal and Bani Abd bin Thalba in Ramadan 7H. They killed some of the enemy's men and captured their cattle and camels. Usama bin Zaid killed Mardus bin Nashik, a polytheist, but after he had pronounced the testimony of Allah's oneness, to which incident the Prophet, PBUH, commented addressing his companions, "Would you rip open his heart to discern whether he is truthful or a liar?" 5. A 30 horseman group headed by Abdullah bin Rawaha marched towards Khaybar on reports that Asir, or Bashir bin Razam, was rallying the ranks of Bani Ghatfan to attack the Muslims. they managed to persuade the Jew to follow them to Medina, encouraging him that the Prophet, PBUH, would institute him as a ruler of Khaybar. On their way back there occurred a sort of misunderstanding that gave rise to fierce fighting between the two parties, resulting in the death of Asir and the 30 men with him. 6. In Shawwal 7H, Bashir bin Saad al-Ansari marched towards Yemen and Jabbar at the head of 300 Muslim fighters to subdue a large mob of polytheists who gathered to raid the outskirts of Medina. Bashir and his men used to march at night and lurk during the day until they reached their destination. Having heard about the advent of the Muslims, the polytheists fled away, leaving behind them a large booty and 2 men who later embraced Islam on arrival in Medina. 7. In the year 7H, shortly before the compensatory Umrah, lesser pilgrimage, a man called Jajm bin Muawiyah came to a spot called Gaba where he wanted to gather the people of Qais and entice them into fighting the Muslim.